Thank you, and thanks both of the ODI leaders here for bringing sort of current research and your insights. Look, we're going to open the floor right now. I just have one question of clarification, if I may. Justin, you showed those really interesting charts, and you went over quite quickly how you calculated what you call the TCI, the Technology Choice Index. Would you just I want to make sure that we actually all understand how you did that, because it wasn't entirely clear from the chart. The TCI is estimated how?
It's intended to measure how far away the country deviate from the comparative advantages. Because in an idealized world, if the government does not have any intervention, the marginal value added to all the workers should be the same across all the region, across all the industries, because wage rate will be equalized. And if wage rate equalized, that means that margin productivity of the labor should be the same. And in that kind of situation, the TCI should be close to 1. And and then if you have some kind of industrial policy to support the capital-intensive sectors, you need to distort the price system and give them monopoly position. So in the end, they charge higher output price. At the same time, the government need to reduce all the input cost, capital, foreign exchange, and resources, and so they can have a large profit margin. And also, they will employ just a small number of workers. So under the kind of situation, the industrial sector is going to have a much higher value added for workers compared to the rest of the economy. So I use that as indicators of how far away the country deviates from the comparative advantages.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much indeed. And maybe later on, Ha-Joon, because they were quite striking, your charts, and the more we can focus here on evidence, the better, I think. We're going to open up the floor. Maybe you could just say who you are. We'll go there and then here. Good. And if you could use the microphone, since you're being listened to on computers all around the world as you speak. So.
Okay, just to come back to the point that countries should not defy their comparative advantage. I mean, both speakers seem to agree that countries shouldn't try to do that too much. But what do you say to those countries that have? Is it a case of trying to retrofit industrial policy, and how do you do that?
Great. Let's take maybe 3 or 4 questions and comments. And if you'd say who you are, please.
Hans-Peter Ulrich, Civio Public Policy Consulting. Actually, one of the last times one participant said to me, when one gets to ODIs and to these debates, one sometimes wonders, what does one learn new from such a debate? There doesn't seem to be much new in many of these issues. They appear to present so much common sense. This morning, it seems to be completely different. This is such a complex topic that I think to digest it really, one needs to do a lot of reading and research. It's a very complicated topic. The topic is at the heart of the matter, in my view. Whether we succeed to reduce poverty or not depends on how we answer this question. What the decisive issue is between deciding Justin's view and Ha-Joon's view is really very difficult to say. Maybe it's just the questions, how can we make money? Yeah, that is, in order to reduce poverty, that might be the decisive question to answer. Dirk Willem mentioned one point of importance. The question is, which role does the state have in deciding which strategy to adopt? Here is one issue that I think the question of the role of the state is even too narrow. The question is how to make the development system effective. It's not only controlling the states, it's controlling the development system and moving from this debate to action. And here we still have a huge deficit. I've offered to ODI to discuss exactly this question. And so far, ODI hasn't recognized the relevance of it. But it is a very relevant question.
Great.
Maybe
Thanks.
one last point.
Briefly.
States are like entrepreneurs, says Porter, I think. What a good or a bad entrepreneur is finally shows in the success in the venture, in the way he understands these things and applies them. We can't forget the application of issues.
Great. Thank you very much for here.
Thanks. Good morning. My name is Lanre Akinola. I write for a magazine called This is Africa at the Financial Times Limited. This is a question for Mr. Lee, and I'd like to get his thoughts on a point that was made by Mr. Chang during his presentation, which was on the fact that a lot of the discussion about industrial policy tends to focus on the kind of the three striking post-World War II examples of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And he was suggesting that if you look at those countries that have undergone successful process of industrial development, including the United States, the United Kingdom, Western Europe, and so on, that the hit rate is actually much higher for countries that defy their comparative advantage. I'd like to get Mr. Lee's thoughts on that. When we look at the developed world, that a lot of the countries that are in the position they're in now, such as the United States, have gone through processes of defining their comparative advantage. Also, a question in addition to that is, where are the countries that have reached their current level of industrial development, successful industrial development, by sticking to their comparative advantage?
Thanks very much. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Peter Matthews from Engineers Against Poverty. I suspect the answer to my question is in the debate, but I haven't a chance to read it. You'll forgive me if it's fairly basic. It's directed primarily at Justin, but I'd be interested to hear what the other panel members have to say about it. It's not completely clear, Justin, the extent to which the argument you set out this morning either departs from or is consistent with the Washington consensus that's dominated thinking within the World Bank for the last 20 years. So could you just say a little bit about that, please?
Okay, thank you. That's 4 questions. Let's turn to Justin and Ha-Joon, and then if you want to add anything.
Okay. Well, all these are very good questions, and certainly I hope to answer as much as possible, if time allows. The first one regarded to the comments from Ha-Joon. He said that we need to, define comparative advantage and to go ahead, because otherwise you might be locked in your industrial development. Mm-hmm. And for that, I think that, when I talk about the role of the government, one is information role. Certainly the government should provide information about the potential, the market size, and all those kind of information in order to be, avoid being locked. That's one thing. And secondly, to avoid being locked, you may also, first you have a right direction. For example, you want to develop car industries. And a car industry, you can start with components instead of the whole integral plant, right? And by that way, if you start with components and climb the ladder step by step, you have the right direction. And in each step, you are consistent with your comparative advantage. And your industry will be very competitive. Just use your example, Toyota. Yes, Toyota started developing in the 1950s with a lot of protection. But the success of Japan, of the car industry, started in mid-1960s. At that time, they already have a lot of components firm, and they also export components to the US and so on. So by that time, although, as you mentioned, MITI at the beginning only wanted to support 2 firms, Nissan and Toyota. But in effect, more than 10 firms entered, including Honda and so on. Yeah. And they are all equally successful because they already have such successful components industry. And for the new firm to enter, it's very easy. Basically, they just do design and assembly. And so from that, my argument that even you did not have the protection to the Toyota in the 1950s, and as long as you develop the components industry and get into the global trading system, export the component to the US, you can be equally successful. And in some extent, Taiwan was in that case, right? If you look into the car industry, define not only the whole car, including the components. Actually, Taiwan's car industry was almost as large as Korean car industry, as a potential GDP and so on. But Taiwan did not impose so much in the protection. And if you see the per capita income growth in Taiwan was faster than Korea. And also Taiwan's economy was more stable than Korean economy. That's the first answer to you. And the second one, you say, well, comparative advantage to, because you do not have one best practice, one best technology. For that, I agree. Certainly, industry which is consistent with the same comparative advantage can be a large number. And each country can only specialize in certain industries. However, no matter which industry is specialized, if they want to be competitive in an open market, they have to be consistent with the competitive advantage of the economy. So I don't see it's a contradiction. Certainly, the country, when they move, they need to produce certain specific product. That's a specialization issue. We know that in terms of trade, one is factor endowment, the other one is specialization. But when you talk about industrial upgrading, we first talk about the endowment changes and how it determines which direction you need to go. And once you decide to go that direction, you need to choose a product. When you choose a product, certainly you need to specialize on certain product. And then your third comment is that, well, the endowment structural changes. You need to upgrade your industrial structure. But in the industrial structural changes, not everything is instantaneously. For that, I agree. And so that's what we need to the government to coordinate these kind of changes. You need to foresee some kind of changes will be coming in 10 years. So you started to provide education so to foresee those kind of changes. And you can also see, you need to improve infrastructure, you need to improve the financial structure and so on. And those kind of things certainly cannot be changed instantaneously. So that's why we need to have the government to coordinate those kind of changes. And then we talk about the collective knowledge, and that is social capital kind of thing. And certainly, depending on what kind of product you start to produce, you accumulate certain kind of social capital, networking, and so on. But if you want to move into certain kind of product, you don't have those kind of social networking, collective knowledge, and so on. The government can do things. One is to encourage foreign direct investment, to bring in those kind of social capitals, or networking, and so on. Or to do some kind of incubation in order to help the firm to overcome those kind of drawbacks. And then you use a lot of example, like Nokia and Korea Steel. That, we in our debate we already mentioned about that. I just like to mention. My idea is that the majority of the production activity in a country need to be consistent with their competitive advantages. Otherwise, the economy cannot be competitive. But certainly, we are in a dynamic process. So you need to have some firm to experiment to some new areas. But those kind of activity is just a small portion of the whole activity in the economy. And we cannot just see that small activities and to infer all activity in the country need to go in that direction. So we need to help distinguish this. We often say, maybe today we do not say that often, quantitative difference can cause qualitative difference.
That's smart.
and you focus on the small activities and you make a lot of argument about that. And that can cause qualitative difference.
And we want to move on now, but
Yeah.
are you different from the Washington Consensus?
Okay. I think that I'm different from Washington Consensus because in the Washington Consensus, basically, the government need to play a very passive role. And my role of government is much more proactive. You can see in all my argument, I think the government has a function of information to tap into this information advantage compared to the developed country. You know what kind of direction might be right. And to coordinate different kind of activities. And in this coordination, sometimes the government need to do that. I can give a few examples. For example, Peru, asparagus. Farmer already identified asparagus as a potential product in 1950s. But for 30 years, the sector did not develop. Only by the time 1985, they started to take off. And the reason they started to take off, one was USAID gave a grant to the Pharma Association in order to invite 2 experts from UC Davis. One to give technological advice about how to grow some kind of new varieties. The other one is how to do the packaging and do the marketing in order to enter into the US market. Individual farmer would not have the incentive to do that. Because if you acquire that information, immediately the other people can imitate. That is so-called externality issue. So you need to have external support for that. Secondly, if you want to export asparagus to the US or to any developed countries market, you need to have the packaging to fulfill those kind of sanitation standards. And for those kind of packaging, freezing, that require heavy capital investment. That's very capital intensive. Individual firm, it's very hard to do that. So the Peruvian government made one investment in the packaging and actually provide about 70% of service in Peru. And all of a sudden, the asparagus industry boomed. Now it became the largest exporter of asparagus in the whole world, overtaking China.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Overtaking China.
Ha-Joon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
We close at 1:45, so I want to have one more round.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. No. I'll try to be quick. Yeah. I mean, first reacting to Justin's comments. Well, I think really, I mean, we come from different theoretical traditions, but in the end, when you get down to what the government should actually do and how they should do it, I think there's actually a very large overlap. And I mean, it's a matter of differences in emphasis and so on. So I don't see that there's some irreconcilable kind of chasm between the two of us, as there is between me and many other people. Well, that's me. What can you do? Yeah. I mean, I'm glad that Justin agrees that some firms have to experiment. I wasn't, trying to suggest that, all industries that led Korean development was steel and automobile. So that until the mid 1980s, the biggest export sector was textile. Huh? But even there, the government intervened quite a lot because although it was broadly that compatible with comparative advantage and so on, they needed marketing help. They needed help with research and development because they tend to be relatively small firms. And so, even succeeding in comparative advantage at conforming industries, you need government help. And they got all kinds of help with export subsidies and so on. And in the end, you need a mixture. On the your frontier, there have to be some firms which defy comparative advantage, which will become the leading industries 10, 15 years later. But in the meantime, you don't want to neglect, or even persecute the industries that are conforming to your current comparative advantage, because that's where you are going to get the foreign exchange that you need to develop new industries, because you have to import technologies, be it in the form of machines or licensing. So you need an integrated stage strategy between protectionism, export subsidies, and in certain areas free trade. Sometimes conforming to, sometimes defying your comparative advantages. So we get there in through different routes, but we are more or less in the same neighborhood. Huh? But one point on the car industry, yes, what you say about Japan is very correct. But actually, the developing components industries is more difficult than the developing assembly industry, because Korea did it from the other end. Because they initially imported 80% of parts from Japan, and only then slowly. So there are different routes, but the main reason there was Korea was basically technologically the least developed in East Asia. You know, for example, in 1960, Japan had per capita income of $400, Taiwan 120, South Korea only 80. So it was by far the most backward economy there. So they actually had to start with assembly, and you know, I mean this still is the weakness of the Korean car industry. So I'm not saying that everything was successful there, but those technological constraints can be quite strong. Responding to the questions from the floor.
Why don't you just pick one?
Yes, I can actually pick one. Yes. No. Yeah. No, basically, I agree completely with you that you need to see it as, I mean, the sort of public sector equivalent of people debating how to succeed in business. Yeah? You know, that my view is that it involves a lot of uncertainties and kind of the initiatives and so on. So you cannot really predict. I mean, if succeeding in business was so easy, I mean, that could be theorized. I mean, all you need to do is to pick up a book, read it, and run a farm. Yeah, it doesn't work like that. Yeah. So government policy, I see it in the same way. I mean, so there'll be always elements of surprises. Yeah, there'll be always cases where countries went for something against everyone's advice and succeeded. There'll be always cases where they went for something that was obvious and then failed. So we have to see it in that way. But I'm not saying that it's not. I mean, I'm not saying that it's all relative, because there are some strategies that make everyone more successful in absolute terms. Yeah. So, for example, history has proven that, except in some exceptional cases, you have to develop manufacturing industries and get out of agriculture in order to achieve high standard of living. Yeah? So by pursuing manufacturing-based strategy, all countries become better off than what they could have been without that strategy. But that doesn't mean that everyone's going to succeed, because some countries will be only slightly better off than what they could have achieved on the sort of agrarian strategy, while others will be way, way up there. So.
Thank you very much, Ha-Joon. You want a quick comment from Dirk Willem, and then open it up briefly. And no speeches, questions.
Two small points. Is it different from the Washington consensus? I think one test could be the number of times the word industrial policy will feature in future World Development Reports. I've done word count of the past World Development Reports, and they feature perhaps once or twice. And I think that might be one test. Where
it usually has an expletive after it.
One more point about the measuring. I think that if you if a country like Ethiopia attracts an electronics plant, it will have a high TCI. If the UK attracts a lot of farming, it might have a very low TCI. But I think you need to think about short-term, long-term. That's an important point, because a country like Ireland, Singapore, defied its comparative advantage. Will have had a high TCI in the 60s, but worked at decreasing the TCI by stimulating suppliers and so on, who supplied to the electronics firms. So I think there's also a short-term, long-term picture that you might want to explore.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, couple.
My name is Hugh Wendon Smith. I used to work for the Ministry of Overseas Development a long time ago. I'm now a researcher. My current interest is urbanisation and more generally the influence of geography on development. And I'm slightly surprised that it has received no mention at all in this debate. Is it not the case that urbanisation, which is proceeding rapidly in many countries, is highly conducive to industrialisation, first by making labour markets work better, secondly by making the exchange of information more effective, and thirdly by providing an opportunity for governments, if they take it, to provide a lot of social and economic overhead capital of the kind that's been mentioned as one of the things that's lacking. Thank you.
Thank you. Down here.
Hi, my name is Madeline Evans. I'm a student at London School of Economics. This may piggyback on the previous question, but it seems like the solution we've reached is to have general industrial policy that's consistent with our current factor endowments, and to have a small section of experimenting firms that are trying to look for these more mature production technologies. My question is, how do we make sure that the experimenting sector is going to be consistent with our future factor endowments, or rather, how do we make our future factor endowments consistent with this eventually successful, we assume, sector? Thank you.
Thank you. Two more, one here and one over there. Okay, I'll take me.
My name is Jeff Tan. I'm from lecturer at Aga Khan University. My question's specifically, I guess, for Justin Lin. You talk about the need for industrial policy, and I'm glad to see a sort of World Bank position shifting towards that. But how do you reconcile that with World Bank policies promoting trade liberalization and openness? In other words, policies which frown upon protection. And related to that, I guess, is the whole issue of technological catching up, which is one of the key issues with industrial upgrading, and how that relates with, how that squares with international intellectual property rights protection.
Thank you. And over here, got a couple, well, three very brief ones then, all three of you.
Go ahead. Okay, good morning. I'm Joy Oyarine from Decision Support, a research company in sub-Saharan Africa. What I want to comment on is what Karen said about large companies pretty much overstating their influence over every other person. I see that a lot in some of the countries in West Africa. I'm just curious as to how can we, what's your suggestion on what to do? In particular, in Nigeria, I do know that a particular, I don't know what to call him, merchant, that would be the best word, has taken over like 70% of the port. I mean, it's so ridiculous. What can be done?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Penny Barrow-Sansa from Birkbeck College, and it's a similar question, particularly to Dirk, William, and Karen. Is we're not talking about power here, and we are talking about power here, but we're not talking about it explicitly. In state-business relations, and the idea that big business, that the state, big business is vulnerable to the state, when clearly a process over time, the state becomes vulnerable to big business. You know, I think that needs to be raised explicitly.
Thanks. You sure? Okay, that's great. We've got 5 minutes for answers to questions, but make it more difficult. I want to ask a question as well. The way the pattern of conversation is going is Ha-Joon saying, look, I'll give you lots of examples where countries actually have not followed their comparative advantage and they've done well. And Justin said, well, actually, if you look more carefully, that really was their comparative advantage. And then they sort of say, well, we're not so far apart, you know, and that's how we're going to end this discussion. Which is sort of not so interesting, actually. So my question is, and the issue is not whether countries should try to address informational externalities or coordination issues. I mean, all of us have worked in countries where there have been lots of projects, such as the USAID one you talked about in Peru. The issue is, do we have a methodology when we go into countries and are asked for advice, or more importantly, the countries themselves are trying to figure it out themselves, to what extent should we put real distortions into this economy in terms of trade barriers or trade protection, and real money into this particular effort through tax holidays or through direct subsidies? Are we in agreement now that we have a methodology that is pretty solid? I mean, if we had Ricardo Hausmann here, he'd say, well, no, I've got a methodology, I think it's right, but actually the way you other guys are doing it is wrong. So what we need to do is try and leave this room with do we have a toolkit as opposed to the more theoretical thing? By the way, I mean, it's been a fantastic debate, so I'll say that when we end, but I just wanted to sort of sow that seed. We have 5 minutes, and I suggest that all four of you have a brief chance to answer. Thanks.
I'll try to be as quick as possible, and I to summarize. Their question about the role of the state. In fact, I discussed four roles of the state in my presentation, and because of time, I did not elaborate that. But we can find some time to elaborate that. The second one, Karen, warning about the situation of political capture. state business relation. And I like to say, the far away you go against your competitive advantages, the more protection and subsidy will be required. And that will subject to more serious political capture. So if they follow the competitive advantages in promoting the industries, the compensation for externality will be very small. I think maybe 20% or 30% reduction in income tax for a few years will be enough to overcome that. And under the kind of situation, I think the risk of political capture will be smaller. And then regarding the issue of trade liberalization openness, and then related to the question asked by the ladies here, and what I like to promote is that the country started with a lot of distortion, and then certainly they have sectors who are getting their competitive advantage from in there are not well. Under the kind of situation, the way might be to carry out some kind of dual track approach, to provide some kind of transitory protection and subsidy to the sectors. But liberalize the sectors which the country has competitive advantages, allow free entry, incurring foreign direct investment in those areas. And by this way, the country can achieve stability and dynamic growth simultaneously. And when they have dynamic growth, they will create more resources to deal with the old protected sectors. And then the question, I try to answer that. First one, if they started with distortion, just as I mentioned, some kind of dual track approach. And for the sector they like to promote, they can follow these 5 steps I identified. Yeah. The first one, to look at other countries that are 30%, 40% higher than your per capita income to see what they produce. And you have a list of products in your mind. And then narrow down those list of products by what kind of product use more of your abundant factors or your unique endowment, like weather or soil type. And then among those list of products, see whether some domestic firm already entered, just like the Bavarian asparagus, and see what restrict them, what constraint to expand, to become a dynamic sectors, and help them to remove those kind of constraints. If this is a product which is completely new, for example, salmon in Chile, then you can invite foreign direct investment to come, to tap into those kind of unique weather or ocean, and then help them to, come to cultivate or to develop those kind of social networking or collective knowledge. And the last one, when you want to upgrade your industry and so on, the infrastructure, the legal system, the administrative system need to change. It's hard to change the whole system simultaneously. You can have an industrial zone, industrial park, and to improve those kind of infrastructure and to reduce the transaction cost. So this is likely, the way I propose to answer your question.
Thank you, Justin. We'll let ODI have the final word. So unless you want to, no. Well, let's go to Ha-Joon.
Okay. Yes. How do you do it? I mean, once again, I repeat my earlier point. I mean, if we knew this, every country will be a success. Huh? So by definition, this is going to be difficult. But I mean, yes. I mean, I like Justin saying that you have to look at countries slightly ahead of you, and try to emulate that at least some of the things they are doing. But I would suggest that you have to be somewhat more ambitious than that. I mean, when Korea was devising its strategy in the 60s, they looked at Taiwan, which was 50% ahead, and Japan, which was 5 times ahead. So, I mean, the range could be the larger. And indeed, I mean, it's a bit curious because when it comes to individuals, we tell our youngsters to aim the highest. Read Bill Gates' biography, read Kofi Annan's life story, when most of, 99% of them will end up as production line workers and shop assistants. So why can't countries be more ambitious? I'm not saying that everyone will become Bill Gates, that everyone will become Finland. Forget it. It's not going to happen, but they should aim higher, I think. And one, the last point, I think that we really need to look more carefully into the role of intermediate institutions that Dirk and Karen both emphasize. I mean, deliberation councils, industry associations, industrial districts that you find in Germany and Italy, the cooperatives that Justin mentioned in relation to asparaguses. And I mean, these things are all necessary because, as Dirk rightly pointed out, that we don't have perfect information. Yeah? You know, I mean, if you build a system on the assumption that you have perfect information, you have the failure of Soviet planning. Huh? But despite having imperfect information, we make those decisions because we have built all those institutions to kind of reduce that problem. Huh? So I think we should put more effort into looking at those intermediate institutions.
Great. Thank you very much, Ha-Joon. Karen, final word from you.
Thank you. Just to briefly respond to those questions about competition, I think that in terms of having ownership of 70% of the port, for example, I mean, in principle, the way to tackle it is to have a competition policy and a competition authority who can tackle those kinds of problems. In practice, that's very challenging, and we've looked at that across these developing countries that we've been working on. And often what happens is that they also get captured by political and business interests. So it's very tricky, but in principle, that is the solution. I agree with the point, it's about power. It's definitely about bargaining power between government and business. There's an opinion piece which may be out on the table, but anyway, it's on ODI's website looking at that and talking about how it's the elite, government and business together who there is a power struggle going on continually, and that it talks about some of the examples from our research in that as well. Just quickly on your question about do we have a methodology? No, I don't think we do have a methodology. I think it's there's lots of uncertainties and trade-offs going on. It's very hard to actually ever know which is the best way to go. I think it's a complicated world, and to some extent everyone has to sort of muddle through, developed and developing countries alike. I think the fact that the crisis has led people to start thinking more about the role of government, again, is probably a good thing, but I hope we don't go too far in the opposite direction as well. I'll just say that.
Thank you very much, Karen.
Yeah. On that point, I think about do we have a methodology? I think I have the same answer. I don't think we have it at the moment, and it's quite important to think about what industrial policies work when and how, and that we learn from that. And to think about the statistical pictures that you're looking at, I think that's going to be very helpful. And then to think about in which circumstances did it work, when didn't it work? Was it a short-term, long-term picture? Was it particular types of policy on the particular types of conditions that worked? A second strand, I think, of this argument would say whether or not you have a toolkit may not matter. Let's think about institutional setup behind it. Let's make sure that is right and that there is good communication within a country amongst all of the sectors, that the power battles are channeled in a particular way, in a transparent way, as much as possible, that there's a strong institutional setup that can help to select what types of policies are going to be helpful, and that there's some consensus about moving forward. And I think there are two ways forward here. I'd like to thank Justin and Ha-Joon and Andrew for this debate.
Good. Well, I would like to thank you. So, this has been a very good debate, extremely good-natured, very substantive. I mean, it's really great to see two very big brains who have slightly different views but are very good friends, and trying to sort of open this up and shed light on it for us. And thank those at ODI, Dirk, Willem and Karen for organising this. I suggest we need another debate a year from now. I think you're right, we're muddling through, but I don't think that's really acceptable. I think these issues are incredibly important. Certainly where I sit in DFID, this is a hugely live issue for our clients at the head of state level. They want to know what they should be doing in this complex world precisely when they look at a Costa Rica and they see Intel. You know, am I missing out something? What should I do? What are the big issues that I could take on without totally and utterly distorting my growth path? So muddling through may be where we are now, but it shouldn't stay that way. I think actually Justin's this is actually a really good starting point, and I know, Justin, you are embarking upon a major new research strand at the World Bank precisely on this. And we look forward to supporting you in that. So I hope we can regather coupled with the work that you're doing actually here at ODI with our support, which is incredibly relevant, these intermediating institutions and the kind of public-private sort of thinking that you're doing right now. So thank you all for coming. We're 5 minutes late, but I think it was worth it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.